right, hello again, and thank you so much for joining me this Sunday. I'm Frederica Whitfield. Just days after U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis announced he would resign in February, President Trump is now forcing him out early, saying he'll be gone by New Year's Day. Deputy Secretary Patrick Shanahan will step in as acting secretary. Aides say the president did not realize how critical Mattis's resignation letter was until he started watching news coverage and realized Mattis quit in protest of his foreign policy and his surprise decision to withdraw troops from Syria. CNN Pentagon correspondent Barbara Starr joining us now. So, Barbara, what do we know about Patrick Shanahan? And is the inference here that the president just didn't thoroughly read the letter from Mattis?
Well, he may not have, actually, Fred. What we know is this. There is a new tweet at this hour from the Defense Department where Secretary Mattis pledges that he will work with Patrick Shanahan, his deputy, his number two, who will now become acting Secretary of Defense on January 1st to ensure a smooth transition. That transition was supposed to be a lot longer than January 1st. My colleague, Elise Labott, has learned that it was Secretary of State Mike Pompeo who called Mattis this morning and told him the proposed end of February date to leave the Pentagon wouldn't work. The president wanted him out by January 1st. Now, the sort of more public reason is that the White House felt such a long transition period would leave Mattis as a lame duck. The reality is the president had indeed become irritated with the extensive news coverage about Mattis's departure. So the big question now, who is Patrick Shanahan, who will work as acting Secretary of Defense? He's a 30-year veteran of Boeing, working on both their commercial airplanes and military programs. He came here with the Trump administration, and as deputy, his portfolio has mainly been things like acquisition, arms sales, Space Force, space issues, innovation, the very typical kinds of things, the business matters that appeal to Mr. Trump. But now Shanahan will have to turn to the international stage with no foreign policy experience. He will have to work with NATO, with America's military allies, and with America's military adversaries, or at least keep a pretty sharp eye on them. Fred?
All right, Barbara Starr, thank you so much. All right, joining me right now, retired Rear Admiral John Kirby, a former Pentagon press secretary and a State Department spokesman, a political columnist for The Washington Post, Dan Milbank, and White House correspondent for American Urban Radio Network's April Ryan. Good to see all of you, and happy holidays. All right, so Admiral Kirby, this latest tweet, does that now make for a much smoother transition now between Mattis and Shanahan?
Well, I don't know if it makes it more smooth or more smooth. I will say, though, that putting Shanahan in charge will ensure continuity, and I think that makes perfect sense. And I do think we should take some comfort in the fact that he has been at the Pentagon for a while, and largely the job of a Secretary of Defense is running the programmatic side of the military, the budget issues, and he has a good firm footing in that. So I'm not too worried about that. I also don't think the argument of Mattis being a lame duck makes much sense. I mean, 2 months is more than enough time for the Secretary of Defense to have worked in getting a successor, getting the administration to nominate somebody. That would have been just fine too. I think that Mattis was acting in good faith when he asked for another 60 days to do that. So I think actually it's going to be okay.
Okay, and so April, the president's initial reaction when Mattis, stepped down after the resignation letter. I mean, he tweeted out, thanks to General Mattis for his distinguished service, etc. And everyone has been pouring over the resignation letter, from General Mattis. And he said, because you have the right to have a Secretary of Defense whose views are better aligned with yours on these and other subjects, I believe it is right for me to step down from my position. But now we're hearing that the president has been unnerved, by this letter. And so he's expediting this exit. Why? Yeah. Why is this making matters better?
Well, first of all, the president does not, and it's hard to even say, this president does not really like to read a lot. I mean, he does bullet points, and maybe someone gave him the bullet points of the letter, and then he heard the rejection of him on television. He doesn't like that. But the problem is the president needs to really sit down and read what comes before him. Two, I'm hearing from sources that this is not going to bode well with troops, and Admiral Kirby is great, but the troops, I hear, want someone more than a bureaucrat. You know, this is not. We're going to see how this goes over. It just doesn't sit well in this moment in time.
Right. I mean, apparently already
troops,
troops had been saying, you know, Mattis was revered, and they trusted him.
Yeah.
And to hear that he is resigning is upsetting, especially those who are abroad.
Yeah, and people are even saying that this is going to kind of resemble what happened with Tillerson. You had someone from the outside, someone who was in Exxon, but you did have Condoleezza Rice give him a glowing endorsement. He understood foreign policy, but you have a bureaucrat who is sitting there versus someone who had been on the field, on the playing field, on the ground. It's more than just pushing paper. It's understanding the stakes that are so high right now, the activity, the possible activity, or the withdrawal in various parts of this world.
Okay, and so Dana, you know, President Trump will start this year with, you know, big cabinet turnover. You know, it's not just Mattis, but it's John Kelly, you know, Ryan Zinke, Nikki Haley. You know, her last day is December 31st. I mean, this is a lot, and the word chaos has been used a lot to associate what's happening in this administration and in this White House. But the White House is saying this isn't chaos. The president says, you know, I'm in the driver's seat here. I know what I'm doing here, and he's going with his gut.
He is going with his gut, Fred. The problem is the gut is telling him different things at different moments, as we've seen with this reaction to the Mattis resignation. You had not only Mattis saying he was going to stay on for a couple of months, you had the White House saying that he was going to stay on a couple of months. So that's what gives the sense of chaos. It's not the Shanahan appointment. That's not going to rock people, certainly the way the Whitaker appointment did at Justice. I don't think people are going to doubt his credentials, at least on a short-term basis. The real question is, it shows that there's not a lot of forethought going into major decisions. And one major reason why Mattis wanted to stay on for that period of time is to reassure foreign leaders in foreign capitals that there would be a calm and steady transition. They're already unnerved by the Syria decision, by the Afghanistan decision, and by the Mattis departure. And this is one more thing that just indicates that there's needless instability going on here, even if the underlying appointment isn't problematic.
And then, Admiral, you know, what does it say that the commander-in-chief is not the one who would make that phone call, you know, to Mattis to say, you know, your last day is going to be, you know, January 1st instead of February 28th, but instead it would be the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo?
Yeah, that's really strange. That's the first I heard of that, listening to Barbara. That doesn't make any sense to me at all. I guess it does indicate how much Trump really leans on Pompeo and sort of considers him his closest ally in the cabinet. But it's weird to get a call from the Secretary of State. There's absolutely no precedent for that. I mean, that's not the way it's supposed to be done. If it's not the president himself, you would think it would be the chief of staff. And of course, we only have an incoming acting chief of staff right now. So maybe that's right. But I think it would have been certainly a much more gentlemanly thing for the president to do, to make that call himself.
Okay. And then April, I mean, there's a lot of messiness going on here, you know, and you've got, you know, the Treasury Secretary.
To say the least.
Yeah, to say the least. I'm looking for a nice way to put it, but, you know, it is kind of messy. And you've got, you know, the Secretary, you know, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, who apparently is trying to, you know, allay fears of, you know, big banks out there with the market tumbling, you know, last week, ending this year, you know, historic lows over a decade. And now, reportedly, we are learning that Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, is in Mexico, vacationing with his kids, Cabo San Lucas. So is he making these phone calls from Mexico? I mean, and of all places right now, especially Mexico?
Yeah. While the government is shut down.
Is shut down over this whole wall issue involving Mexico.
Over the wall, yes, the slats, or whatever you want to call them, the impaling slats. It doesn't bode well. Steve Mnuchin is not known for the best optics, because remember a couple of months back, remember he got off that plane and his wife did the Instagram.
Some extravagance.
She was wearing Tom Ford, or very extravagant. This is an administration that sometimes thumbs its nose at tradition and what it looks like and what it should be like. as the government is shut down and the president is still in the White House, even though people are saying this is the Trump shutdown, the president should be at the White House, and even his cabinet officials should at least have the appearance, especially someone who is dealing with money. And right now, money is the issue. You know, you have consumer confidence is down as you're in the midst of a government shutdown. What did the Dow close? How did the Dow close last week? I mean,
even though reportedly Mnuchin on his own dime, you know, commercial, this was not like a government.
Even if it's on its own dime, the optics don't look good.
Yeah.
It's all about money. It's about money, and he's the money man. And they're talking about Sarah Huckabee Sanders didn't realize the taxpayers would ultimately fund the wall. You would think that he would be here to help guide them about what's funding and how you fund it and how taxpayer dollars play. It just, the optics are not good at this moment in time.
Yeah, and then besides optics, you know, there's this, you know, Dana, you call the White House and apparently you hear this. So here's the auditory message.
We apologize, but due to the lapse in federal funding, we are unable to take your call. Once funding has been restored, our operations will resume. Please call back at that time.
I mean, April, you're making me laugh. I'm seeing your head shake. And then Dana, I mean, what's going on here?
Each time this sort of thing happens, we think that it's a gag. But maybe Steve Mnuchin's gone off to Mexico to he's going to get the money for the wall. He's going to bring it back from Los Cabos. He's going to be the hero. The shutdown will be resolved. The markets will stabilize themselves. You know, you don't know whether to laugh or cry at this moment because,
Exactly.
I mean, any one of these things we're talking about, the shutdown, the market turmoil, the Pentagon, the rest of the cabinet, any of the Syria, any of these could be the major crisis headline of the moment, and we just have to juggle them all.
Okay. Thank you so much to all of you. Happy holidays. It is something else. April Ryan, Dana Milbank, Rear Admiral John Kirby. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Fred.
Welcome back. When Robert Mueller finishes his investigation, the president's lawyers have said they might try to block the report from being publicly released. But the incoming chair of the House Intelligence Committee says not so fast. Representative Adam Schiff tells our Jake Tapper he'll force the release if he has to.
We ought to make sure this report is public. Now, there may be parts of the report that have to be redacted because they involve classified information or they involve grand jury material. But here's the thing. For the last 2 years, I've been warning the Justice Department as they've been turning over tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pages of investigative files in the Clinton email investigation that whatever precedent they were going to set, they were going to have to live by, which means that when the Mueller investigation is over, they're not going to be in a position to say, we're not going to provide information to Congress about this investigation. So they've already decided that's the precedent they're going to live by. And at the end of the day, this case is just too important to keep from the American people what it's really about.
All right, joining me right now is CNN legal analyst and former federal prosecutor Ellie Honig. Good to see you. So what is the precedence on, you know, Congress releasing information the president might not want released?
Yeah, so there's a delicate dance that's going to break out here. What's supposed to happen under the regulations is Mueller is supposed to file his report with the Attorney General, whoever is supervising him at that point, and then the Attorney General is going to need to make the decision about whether and how much to turn over to Congress, and that's going to be a complicated and probably politically heated discussion. There's going to be issues of executive privilege. There's going to be issues of grand jury confidentiality that the House is going to have to negotiate with the Attorney General.
So you can bet that the White House attorneys are already trying to figure that out. You know, they're already laying the groundwork for the avenue that they'd want to go.
Yeah, and we've already seen some hints of what some of the White House arguments are going to be. They're going to argue executive privilege. They're going to argue that internal conversations that have happened within the White House with attorneys should not be turned over to Congress, should not be made public. We could see a legal fight similar to the one that we saw with Richard Nixon back in 1974. I think if you look at that opinion from the Supreme Court, it suggests that we will see it publicly, that executive privilege is limited to issues of national security, military secrets, and not so much to issues that intended to insulate somebody from liability.
And then, of course, there's the issue of what will Congress do once it is to receive a report, any version of it. What do they have the power to do? What would they actually act on?
Yeah, I mean, that's both a legal and a political question. I think obviously it's going to depend on the contents of the report. How much of a bombshell is it? How incriminating is it to the president or to others? And then the Congress, the House in particular, is going to have to make the decision. And there's a political calculation. Is it worth it to impeach? I've heard plenty, and I'm sure you have too, Fred, of Democratic representatives say, you know, it's not going to be worth the political cost to impeach. They look back at Bill Clinton. They see that Bill Clinton's approval rating shot up after he was impeached. So there's some reluctance. On the other hand, I think if the report has enough substance to it, I think there comes a point where the Democratic Congress has a job to do, regardless of the political consequences.
And then none of that really obviates whether there will be any kind of other form of prosecution, you know, post any presidential term.
Yeah, I mean, there's an open question about whether DOJ can indict a sitting president. The current guidance within DOJ is that DOJ should not be doing that. I don't think that will change. I don't think we will see an indictment of President Trump while he's in office. There's a separate question about whether DOJ might indict him on his way out. You have to still think about the statute of limitations. Any crime would have to have been committed within 5 years. So that will then turn on, I guess, to an extent, whether the president wins re-election in 2020.
Right. All right. Ellie Honig, good to see you.
Thanks,
Happy
Fred.
holidays.
Are you too?
Another week, another dramatic staff shakeup at the White House. Now the New York Times is reporting the president is becoming increasingly isolated and suspicious. President Trump reportedly asking, why is it like this? We'll discuss next. President Trump and Republican Senator Bob Corker are squaring off on, of all places, Twitter. Corker was on CNN's State of the Union this morning and blasted Trump for the shutdown, saying it is just a political stunt and calling Trump's decision to pull U.S. troops out of Syria a mistake. Not too long after that, President Trump went after Corker on Twitter, writing in part, Bob Corker was responsible for giving us the horrible Iran nuclear deal, which I ended, yet he badmouths me for wanting to bring our young people safely back home. Bob wanted to run and asked for my endorsement. I said no, and the game was over. Senator Corker, well, he fired back via Twitter, saying, yes, just like Mexico is paying for the wall, with the hashtag alert the daycare staff. Yeah, it's gone there now. Let's check in with CNN Sarah Westwood at the White House. So give us a fact check on all of this and how the president is spending his time there at the White House today.
Well, Fred, President Trump and Senator Bob Corker have had a complicated relationship over the past couple of years, to say the least. Corker has at times been a supporter of the Trump administration's agenda, at times been a critic. But president's claim that Corker backed the Iran nuclear deal is just simply not true. Corker was actually a vehement critic of the Iran nuclear agreement as negotiated by the Obama administration. And in 2015, Corker wrote in an op-ed for the Washington Post that Congress should reject that deal. But this is not the first time that the president has used that false attack against Corker. They were feuding last fall when the president first brought it up. And Trump also falsely claimed that Corker came to him and requested an endorsement, and then, absent that presidential endorsement, was unable to run for re-election because his poll numbers tanked. Nearly the opposite scenario is what actually happened. CNN reported at the time that the president offered to endorse Corker and asked Corker to reconsider his decision to retire early, imploring him to run again. But the president, frequently sensitive to criticism from fellow Republicans, although we should note at one time he did have enough respect for Corker to consider him as a potential running mate and later as a potential Secretary of State. But Fred, Corker is just one of several Republicans who have been critical of Trump, who will not be returning to Washington in the new year.
Oh, how things have changed. Okay, Sarah Westwood, thanks so much from the White House. So a lot of presidential candidates might think they alone can fix America's problems, but Donald Trump actually said so out loud. And now, 2 years after voters gave him the chance, a devastating portrait in the New York Times details just how alone the president feels, or at least how alone he might be. I'm joined now by CNN chief media correspondent and anchor of CNN's Reliable Sources, Brian Stelter. All right, Brian, good to see you. So we're talking about him feeling very alone, or at least the article kind of paints that portrait, increasingly paranoid even, according to the Times. But this as he sheds staff or fires people. So, you know, is he alone because of his own actions, or is he alone because he's finding out that he's not getting a whole lot of support?
Yeah,
for
in some
his
ways,
policies?
you know, he says he wants loyalists around him. He's had people leaving the administration who are not loyal to his agenda, but the Times describes him as increasingly isolated. Maggie Haberman and Peter Baker say, describing him without using the word paranoid as saying he sounds paranoid. Here's a part of the story that describes the president's TV consumption. It says he's spending ever more time in front of a television, often retreating to his residence upstairs, out of concern that he is being watched too closely, suggesting he doesn't like people knowing that he's watching so much TV. But obviously that TV feedback loop is part of what's going on here. It's part of the problem here. He's raging against the coverage. That's what led him to push Mattis out early. And that's a vicious cycle. You know, we hear about a virtuous cycle, something good. This is a vicious cycle making things worse.
So it paints the picture that he's more consumed with how people are discussing, you know, evaluating how he's doing the job as opposed to being consumed about doing the job.
Right, this is the as seen on TV president, the as seen on TV presidency. So he sees something on TV, he lashes out about it, and then the cycle resumes. It is not a healthy cycle for any politician, never mind the president. And I think that's why we're seeing increasing concern among Republicans. By the way, there's lots of reasons for them to be concerned, but one of them is his behavior, his lashing out, his responses on Twitter to various news stories and to various subjects. The president seems very influenced by right-wing news, not right-wing news outlets, right-wing entertainers like Rush Limbaugh and Ann Coulter. He does not seem so influenced by his own staff.
Right, hence more recently on the whole, you know, spending proposal, and he was on board, and then suddenly he wasn't after hearing, you know, from them or hearing their sentiments. So the next 2 years, you know, likely they could be harder for Trump, right, than the last two. And will it be because of this, you know, right-wing media echo chamber? Or, you know, will this isolation kind of get the best of him?
Well, the next 2 years will be harder for him and for his staff, in part because the Democratic control of the House, even more investigations than we've seen so far. But also, you know, the Times describes the president as lashing out at his aides, cursing at his staff. It sounds like a hard place to work right now, maybe getting harder in the new year.
All right, Brian Stelter, thank you so much.
Thanks.
All right, we've got so much more straight ahead in the newsroom right after this.